My name is Lena Hartman, 29 years old, and for most of my life, I was the disappointment in my family's picture-perfect world. The Hartmans were old Atlanta money, generations of privilege wrapped in polished smiles and unspoken rules. But me? I never fit their mold. I built a tech consultancy from scratch while they built reputations on inheritance and appearances. That night, as I sat at the long mahogany table beneath the crystal chandelier, I felt like a stranger in my own home. My mother, Vivian, sparkled in her pearls, every hair perfectly in place. My father, Charles, the real estate mogul with a reputation sharper than his suits, sat at the head of the table, commanding, untouchable. And across from me was Blake, my older brother, their golden child, the CEO of the family firm, the one who could do no wrong. Dinner was their stage, and I was the target. "So, Lena," my mother began, slicing into her fillet with surgical precision, "how's your little company doing these days? Still chasing clients who can't afford you?" Her tone was sweet poison. My father didn't even look up as he muttered, "You should have joined the family business when I offered. That independence thing of yours doesn't pay bills forever." Blake chuckled, a short, arrogant laugh that made my jaw tighten. "Come on, Dad. She's trying," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Some people just aren't meant for leadership. Not everyone can handle pressure." Their words stung, but I'd heard them all before. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that everything they valued, every ounce of their empire, was standing right in front of them. I stayed quiet, forcing a polite smile. The silverware clinked, laughter filled the air, and I let them talk. I'd learned long ago, let the wolves howl. They never notice the fire until it's too close. When dessert arrived, my mother's voice cut through the chatter again. "Lena, honey, maybe it's time to stop pretending. You've had your fun. Why not sell whatever's left of your business and come work for Blake?" The room laughed, even Blake smirked, basking in the spotlight, and I realized they still thought I needed them. But tonight would change everything, because in my pocket my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Confidential Hartman Holdings transfer complete." My pulse steadied. They had no idea the company they were so proud of, the one that built their legacy, was no longer theirs. I looked up at my family, still laughing, and smiled to myself. The wolves had no idea they were already surrounded by fire. I stared at the flickering candlelight dancing across the polished table as my family laughed, their voices echoing like ghosts from a life I no longer belonged to. Blake lifted his glass of wine, swirling it like he was in some magazine cover shoot. "To family," he said, flashing that smug grin of his. "To success, legacy, and knowing when to quit." His eyes locked on mine during that last line, sharp and deliberate. I smiled, small, controlled, polite, the kind of smile that hides a loaded secret. Dad chuckled. "You always had the business sense, son. You remind me of myself at your age. Focused, strategic." Then, without missing a beat, he turned to me. "Unlike your sister, who still thinks independence means ignoring good advice." Mom laughed softly, tapping her diamond ring against the stem of her glass. "She's always been sensitive. Remember when she quit her job at the firm because she didn't like the office culture? Imagine if she'd stayed, she might have learned something." My jaw clenched. They always brought that up. They loved reminding me how I'd walked away from the Hartman family company years ago. The same company they thought I'd failed without. I set my fork down carefully. "You're right," I said. "I didn't fit in there. I guess I preferred working for companies that actually value integrity." The table went quiet for a moment, just a second of silence that felt like a crack running through glass. Blake laughed it off. "Integrity doesn't pay dividends. Success, results do." He leaned forward. "Look, I get it. You've always had this rebellious streak. But come on, you could have had everything. The salary, the security, the respect." "The respect?" I tilted my head. "Funny. I don't remember getting much of that, even when I was breaking records for the firm's clients." Blake's smile faltered for the first time. Mom frowned. "Lena, there's no need to bring up old history. This is a celebration, not a debate." "Celebration?" I asked quietly. My father nodded. "Blake just finalized a major investment deal. It's going to double the firm's value within the quarter." I almost laughed. I already knew about the deal. I'd seen the contracts myself before the transfer went through. He was celebrating something he didn't even own anymore. That's impressive, I said calmly, taking a sip of water to hide the grin threatening to form. I hope the new majority shareholder appreciates your enthusiasm. Blake blinked. What? Nothing, I said, waving it off. Just thinking out loud. Mom sighed. There she goes again with her cryptic comments. You always have to make everything dramatic, Lena. Why can't you just be happy for your brother? Because you wouldn't be happy for me if the tables were turned, I thought. Instead, I simply said, don't worry, Mom. I'm happy for him, truly. I think he's about to learn a lot about what success really means. Dad looked at me sharply, something flickering in his eyes. Suspicion. Maybe. For the first time all evening, he actually looked uncertain. And that's when I realized it. The cracks had finally started to show. The room had grown quieter. Even the hum of the chandelier above seemed softer, like the air itself was listening. Blake poured himself another glass of wine, trying to mask the tension with forced confidence. So, Lena, he said, leaning back in his chair, what exactly do you do again? Consulting, right? For startups? He said it the way someone might talk about a hobby that doesn't pay rent. I smiled. That's right. Strategic consulting, acquisitions, restructuring, that sort of thing. My father raised an eyebrow. Restructuring sounds ambitious for a one-woman operation. Oh, it's not just me, I said casually. I have a few partners, some rather high-profile ones, actually. Blake smirked. Really? Anyone we'd know? I set my glass down and looked him straight in the eye. You might, I said softly. You've been emailing one of them all week. He froze, the color draining slightly from his face. Dad looked between us, confused. What's that supposed to mean? I shrugged, pretending to think. Let's just say, business can be a small world. You never know who's sitting on the other side of a negotiation. Blake laughed awkwardly. You're being cryptic again. Typical. Mom cut in, her tone sharp. Lena, enough with the riddles. It's rude. I turned my gaze to her. Calm, unbothered. Is it rude to be honest, or just uncomfortable when someone finally sees the truth? The words hit the table like a glass shattering on marble. Dad cleared his throat. That's enough. We're not here to argue, but his voice carried less authority now. Like even he wasn't sure who had control anymore. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady but quiet. You know, it's funny, for a family that prides itself on control, you've never really known how little of it you actually have. Blake scoffed. Oh, please, don't start one of your lectures about morality or independence. You're sitting at our table, eating our food, paid for by the company I run. My smile widened, but not from amusement, from satisfaction. Blake, I said gently, you should really read the fine print before claiming ownership of anything. He frowned, confused, but I could see Dad stiffen. That flicker of fear again. He sensed it. Something real. Something dangerous. Lena, he said slowly. What exactly are you implying? I met his gaze without flinching. I'm not implying anything, Dad. I'm stating a fact. Mom laughed nervously. A fact that you're jealous of your brother's success? I leaned back, folding my arms. No, I said. A fact that the Hartman legacy you're all celebrating tonight isn't exactly yours anymore. The table went silent. Every fork, every breath, every heartbeat. Still. And for the first time in years, I felt their uncertainty instead of my own. The spark had been lit, and I was done pretending it wouldn't burn. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than the people sitting at the table. My father was the first to break the silence. Lena, he said slowly, voice controlled but trembling underneath. What are you talking about? I looked at him, calm as ever. I'm talking about Hartman Holdings, Dad. The company you built, the company Blake runs, the one that's technically under new management. Mom frowned. That's ridiculous. Charles, she's just trying to get attention again. Don't indulge her. But Dad's face had gone pale. Explain yourself, he demanded. I nodded. Sure, you remember 2 years ago when the company was facing a liquidity issue. You were desperate for silent investors to keep your portfolio from collapsing. You reached out to a few private equity firms, but one in particular made the offer you couldn't refuse. Blake straightened. I handled that deal personally. It was fully legal. The investors are anonymous, yes, but they're vetted. None of them could have been me. I interrupted softly. Blake froze. I continued. My consultancy isn't a startup, Blake. It's an acquisition network. We don't advise companies anymore. We buy them. The air left the room. I reached into my bag, pulled out my tablet, and turned the screen toward them. There it was, the document they never thought they'd see. Hartman Holdings ownership transfer record. Majority shareholder, Lena Hartman. Dad's face went ashen. That's impossible. You would have noticed? I said, my voice steady, but low. You signed it yourself, Dad. You just didn't read the full clause. Remember the investment from Orion Group? That was my shell firm. The silent partner you were so grateful to have. Mom's voice trembled. You tricked us? No, I said, meeting her eyes. I saved you. You were weeks from bankruptcy, remember? I bailed you out when no one else would. You just assumed I couldn't possibly be the one holding the checkbook. Blake slammed his hand on the table. You had no right. I had every right, I said sharply. After the way you treated me. After all the times you called me a failure while living off a company I quietly owned. I stood, my voice steady but full of emotion. You all thought I needed your approval. The truth is, you've been signing my paychecks for 2 years. Blake's mouth opened, then shut again. No words. Dad looked like the air had been punched out of him. Mom's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against her plate. For once, none of them had anything to say. I took a slow breath, watching the realization settle over them like a heavy fog. This dinner was supposed to humiliate me, I said quietly, but all it did was remind me why I walked away. I didn't need to be part of your empire because I built my own. I straightened my jacket, pushing the chair back. And now, it turns out, I own yours too. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. But to me, it was the sweetest silence I'd ever heard. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the shallow, uneven breaths of 3 people whose world had just collapsed. Then Blake exploded. You think this is funny? He shouted, standing so fast his chair screeched across the floor. You tricked us, Lena. You stabbed your own family in the back. I met his fury with calm. Funny? I said. I remember you calling me a liability. Guess I turned out to be an asset after all. Dad's voice cracked as he spoke. You don't understand what you've done. The company, our name, our reputation. Our reputation? I cut in. Dad, your reputation was already crumbling. The lawsuits, the unpaid investors, the layoffs you pretended were strategic restructuring. I kept it all quiet. I fixed your mistakes. Mom finally found her voice, trembling but sharp. You've embarrassed this family. After everything we did for you. I turned to her slowly. Everything you did for me, I repeated. You belittled me. You mocked every choice I made. You made me feel like nothing, until I stopped needing your approval. I built my company without your name, without your money, without your influence. Blake's eyes burned. And you think this makes you powerful? You're still alone, Lena. You'll always be alone. That one almost made me laugh. Maybe, I said softly. But at least I earned my loneliness. You inherited yours. Blake's face flushed red. You can't do this. I'll fight it in court. You could try, I said evenly. But you won't win. Every contract, every transfer, every legal form was signed willingly. I made sure of that. You might have been CEO, but I was the one signing the board approvals behind the scenes. Dad slumped back in his chair, the fight gone from his eyes. How long? He asked quietly. How long have you been planning this? I hesitated, not from guilt, but from memory. The day you told me I wasn't Hartman material, I said. The day you looked me in the eye and said I'd never understand business. The words hit like a physical blow. Mom's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. So this was revenge? I shook my head. No, this was balance. For a long moment, no one said a word. Just the sound of expensive silverware against untouched food. Finally, I stood. You built an empire on control, I said quietly. But you never learned how to respect the people under you. Not even your own daughter. Maybe now, you'll understand what it feels like to lose control. I pushed the chair back, the legs scraping softly against the marble floor. No one stopped me as I walked toward the door. But as I reached the hallway, my father's voice called after me. Broken, small, nothing like the man who once ruled a room. Lena, what happens to us now? I paused, hand on the doorway. That depends on whether you finally learn to listen. Then I turned and walked away, leaving their perfect family dinner in ruins. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the sound of their voices fading behind me. The mansion's lights still glowed through the tall windows, golden, beautiful, and empty. For years, that house had felt like a cage, built on expectations I could never meet. But tonight, it finally looked like what it really was, a monument to pride. My heels clicked against the stone pathway as I walked toward my car. Every step felt lighter. The weight I'd carried for years, the shame, the doubt, the quiet need for their approval, it all lifted, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but peace. I paused at the end of the driveway and looked back one last time. Through the window, I could see my father sitting motionless at the table, Blake pacing furiously, my mother with her face buried in her hands. Three people who had spent their entire lives believing power came from control, and who had just learned it could also come from letting go. My phone buzzed in my hand. A message from my assistant. Transfer confirmed. All assets under your name. Press wants a statement. I smiled faintly. Let them wonder. Let them talk. For once, I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I looked up at the stars, the same sky I used to stare at through my bedroom window, wondering if I'd ever be enough. Now I knew the truth. I always had been. They just never wanted to see it. As I opened my car door, I whispered to myself, not out of pride, but out of peace. Sometimes, you have to lose a family to find yourself. The engine hummed softly as I drove away, the mansion growing smaller in the rearview mirror. The same house where I'd once felt powerless was now just another property, one of many that I owned. And as the city lights appeared ahead, I realized something deeper. I didn't take revenge. I reclaimed respect. Because in the end, power isn't about money or titles. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from my past. I was driving toward my future. If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit that notification bell.